All right, so get this. We're tackling a historical mystery today. And, it involves something delicious. It's the story of Yang Guifei. She was this legendary beauty from China's Tang Dynasty, known for her love of lychees. But seriously, have you ever thought about how she got those exotic fruits all the way out there in the capital city, Chang'an?
Yeah, it's a pretty good question, especially since lychees were originally from southern China, hundreds of miles away from the capital.
Exactly. And we know the emperor just adored Yang Guifei, spared no expense, wanted to give her whatever she craved. So how'd they make that happen? How'd they move those lychees all that way back in the day? Well, we've got some historical records, maps, poetry to sort through today to try to figure it all out. And luckily, I'm joined by our expert in Chinese history, so we can separate the facts from the fiction and hopefully uncover some fun details along the way. So where do we even begin with this lychee mystery?
Well, it comes down to two main possibilities for where Yang Guifei's lychees came from. Lingnan, which is like modern-day Guangdong and Guangxi provinces.
Right.
And then there's Boshu, the region with Sichuan.
So south versus southwest, huh? Okay, so what makes Lingnan a good contender? I mean, it's still really far from Chengyan, isn't it?
Oh yeah, for sure. But we've got some interesting evidence pointing us that way. For one thing, Tang Dynasty writers themselves, like Bao Fang and even the poet Du Fu, they mention Lychees coming from a place called Nanhai, and that refers to the area by the South China Sea, including the Lingnan region.
Ah, so we've got some first-hand accounts, or at least Tang Dynasty version of that, pointing to Lingnan. But wouldn't the transportation have been a total nightmare back then? I mean, even today, keeping fruit fresh over long distances is a challenge. How did they manage that in the 8th century?
That's the big question, especially since we know that Lychees go bad so quickly. Another Tang Dynasty poet, Bai Ji, even wrote about it. But here's where it gets really interesting. We've got to think about the Tang Dynasty's tribute system.
Oh, right, those elaborate gifts and offerings they'd send to the imperial court. That was a pretty big deal back then, right?
Huge, super important for keeping power and showing loyalty. And Lingnan, they were famous for sending rare fruits and spices to the capital. Lychees were a super prized delicacy, so they would have been a natural part of those tributes.
So it's like an ancient version of those fancy fruit baskets you get delivered, except with way higher stakes. But even still, wouldn't the lychees spoil by the time they got to Chang'an?
Right, and that's where the tribute system gets even more interesting. There's a chance, and we've got evidence from later dynasties backing this up, that they actually shipped the lychees while they were still on the branches to keep them fresh.
Whoa, so they shipped whole branches, maybe even entire potted trees. That's incredible. I mean, if they went that far for lychees, what else were they moving like that?
You gotta wonder, right? It really gives you a sense of what they could do back then logistically, and how important it was to keep the emperor happy and everyone he liked. But hold on. Before we get too carried away with our lychee caravans, we should probably talk about the other side of this debate.
Right, Boshu. What's the argument for the lychees coming from there?
Well, some people think that they might have been growing lychees in Sichuan, part of Boshu. But the real issue is geography. Think crazy mountain paths, narrow walkways on cliffs, legendary stuff.
You're talking about that Shenonan saying, right? Roads in Shǒu are harder to climb than to heaven. I always figured those paths were more for mountain goats than people hauling fruit.
Yeah, no kidding. And we're not talking about exaggeration here. There were these narrow walkways called zandao, barely enough space for two people to pass. Imagine trying to move lychees on those. And they got to get to the capital fast.
Okay, yeah, that doesn't sound like a good way to ship delicate fruit. Makes those Lingnan routes look pretty good. So far, Lingnan is winning for me. But I bet this story has a few more twists before we're done.
Yeah, you might be right about that. This next part might change how you see this whole Yang Guifei thing. So there's this other person, always part of this story, a supposed rival for the emperor's attention, Mei Fei.
Oh, right, Mei Fei. And she ties into the lychee thing too, doesn't she? Like some stories say that the emperor favored Yang Guifei with those lychees, over Mei Fei. But is any of that true? Or is that just some ancient gossip?
Okay, get ready for this. Mei Fei might not have even been real.
Wait, seriously, you mean that whole rivalry, maybe even a lychee drama, could be totally made up? Whoa. So what makes historians question whether she really existed?
Basically, it's a lack of evidence. When you look at sources from the Tang Dynasty, like Bai Ji's poems or official documents, there's nothing about Mei Fei.
So if she wasn't a real person, where did she come from? Was it like the story changed over time, getting more and more dramatic with each retelling?
You got it. The first time Mei Fei shows up is in something called the Mei Fei Zhuan, and that wasn't written until the Song Dynasty. way later.
So basically, she was added to the story later on. So it makes things more interesting, I guess. It's like, even history can have some fictional characters thrown in, huh? But, okay, let's say we forget about Mei Fei. There's still this other big part of Yang Guifei's story we haven't touched on, the An Lushan Rebellion.
Right, definitely. One of the biggest things to happen during the Tang Dynasty, a huge civil war, middle of the 8th century, and it really tied Yang Guifei's name to tragedy.
Can you give a quick overview for those who might not know about this rebellion?
Sure thing. It was led by this Tang Dynasty general, An Lushan. He rebelled against the emperor, and it threw the whole empire into chaos.
And Yang Guifei gets caught up in it, right? She was blamed for it?
Yeah, sadly. There was this big event at Meifei during the rebellion. The emperor and his people were running from the rebels, and the imperial guards, they were terrified. So they ended up blaming the whole rebellion on Yang Guifei, like she was the cause of all their problems.
Wow, talk about wrong place, wrong time. But can you really blame a whole rebellion on one person, even if she was an imperial concubine? I mean, these things are usually caused by a lot of different issues, right?
Exactly. Well, Yang Guifei's relationship with An Lushan, who was kind of like a foster son to her, did play a part in how things led up to the rebellion. Blaming it all on her is way too simple. The An Lushan Rebellion was the result of a lot of stuff. Political tensions, economic inequality, people wanting military power. It all kind of came together at a bad time.
So even though it's easy to focus on one person, like Yang Guifei, history is almost never that straightforward. There's always more going on. And thinking about the bigger picture, what about this whole idea of extravagance that we've been talking about with the Lychees? Could that have affected how people saw Yang Guifei and maybe even led to her being blamed? Like if Lychees became a symbol of excess, could that have made people resentful? Maybe even contributing to her fate?
That's a really interesting point. Remember, all the work they put into getting those Lychees. It was a very public display of how much the emperor favored her and how wealthy the court was. That kind of extravagance, especially when there were already economic problems, could definitely make people angry, especially those who weren't benefiting from all that luxury.
So those Lychees, a sign of love and power at first, maybe they also showed some cracks in the empire's stability.
Exactly. They remind us that even the strongest rulers are part of the flow of history, and that even little things can point to bigger tensions and problems.
So Yang Guifei, this amazing woman who just loved her Lychees, became both a legend and someone to blame.
Yeah, her story is a mix of fact and fiction. She shows us that history is rarely black and white. It's all these different stories woven together, each one adding to a bigger, more complex picture.
Man, what a journey. We started with lychee groves, ended up talking about mountain paths, myths, and power struggles in the Tang Dynasty, all thanks to some delicious fruit.
Yeah, it's amazing how one little fruit can have such a big story, right?
Yeah, totally. So before we wrap up our lychee investigation, let's recap. It seems like those lychees Yang Guifei loved probably came from Lingnan. We had those accounts from back then, the whole tribute system. And just thinking about how hard it would have been to move those fruits.
Yeah, all signs point to Lingnan, though I guess we can't completely rule out Bashu.
True, true. And we can't forget about Mei Fei. Turns out she was probably made up later on.
It just goes to show that history's always changing, you know? As we find more evidence, we learn more, and our understanding changes.
Exactly. But one last thing's been bugging me. We talked about all the effort that went into getting those lychees to the emperor, maybe even moving whole trees to keep them fresh. What does that tell us about the Tang Dynasty? About the emperor himself?
That's a good question. I think it says a lot about power, and how the emperor wanted to show everyone he was in charge. Remember, the tribute system wasn't just about practicality, it was a show. Showing loyalty, showing off how much control the emperor had. By going that extra mile for Yang Guifei and her lychee craving, he was basically saying, look, I can get anything from anywhere in the empire. It made him look powerful, and like he really cared for his people.
It's like a lychee-flavored power move.
Wow.
But could it also be seen as, I don't know, a weakness, giving that much attention to one person, even someone he loved? Couldn't that cause problems with other people in the court? Or even the regular folks?
Yeah, you're right. There's always a risk when you should show that much favoritism.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes across as extravagant.
And with Yang Guifei, we saw how that can backfire. All that resentment, the economic problems, and then the rebellion, it all kind of exploded. So those lychees, they started as a symbol of love and power, but they maybe also hinted at trouble to come.
Yeah, I think so. They remind us that no one, not even emperors, are above history, and that sometimes the smallest details can reveal big problems.
Wow, this has been amazing. Learned so much, not just about Lychees, but about the whole Tang dynasty, the power struggles in Yang Guifei's story.
It's incredible how one question about a fruit can lead to all this, isn't it?
Okay,
Makes you think about how we understand the past.
totally. And for anyone who wants to learn more, I'd recommend reading Bai Jui's poems. They really give you a feel for life in the Tang dynasty court.
And if you're interested in the politics of it all.
Definitely look into the An Lushan Rebellion. It's a fascinating and sometimes sad look at a really important time in Chinese history. As we wrap up our deep dive into Yang Guifei's Lychees, I keep thinking, what about our lives? What little things will historians use to tell our story in the future? What will we leave behind?